So I'm pleased to introduce you to Phil Wilson, who is General Manager of the Lower Colorado River Authority as today's distinguished lecturer. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar with the LCRA, its purpose, its mission is to protect people, property, and environment by providing public services for more than 1 million people in Central and Southeast Texas. Now, these services include electricity, water and flood management, public parks along the Highland Lakes and the Lower Colorado River, and community and economic development services to rural and urban communities all throughout the watershed. So that's a big task. In his role as the 11th General Manager of LCRA since 1934, when it was first developed, Phil serves as the Chief Executive Officer and carries out all of the LCR board policy, manages all of the LCRA relationships with its customer and stakeholders, and he, of course, appoints and directs executive staff and oversees projects and operations that support LCRA's public service mission. Now, all that is fancy language for his real job, which is bridge building and consensus building, and he does that full time in his role as general manager. And he's had a lot of experience at bridge building and consensus building, but prior to joining LCRA back in February this year, he was director of the Texas Department of Transportation, and before that, he was senior vice president of public affairs for Luminant, which is Texas's largest electric generation company. And before that, he served in a minor role as Secretary of State, and then before that with the governor's office. So he's had a long-standing history of bridge building and consensus building, which again, if you consider the topic of water, those are two critical key success factors for getting anything done. Because as we well know, water is a rather contentious issue and therefore a litigious issue, and none of this is unfamiliar territory for LCRA. So with that little bit of brief introduction, it's my pleasure to welcome Phil Wilson to the stage. So please join me in giving a rousing Aggie welcome to Phil Wilson.
Howdy, how are y'all? I hear my introduction, I think I can't keep a job. So I'm glad to be here today. Thank you very much. I want to thank the Ellison Chair for this opportunity, International Floriculture, for sponsoring the Distinguished Lecture Series. I think discussion of issues such as water in forums like this serves the public well. Let me first start with some introductions. I'm first pleased to have PJ Ellison with us today. PJ, this chair is named after her family. And PJ serves as a committee chair. She's also a member of LCRA's board of directors in the middle of 2013, so I came on right after she came on board, had the chance to work together. PJ, thank you for your service to LCRA and to Texas A&M University. I'd also like to introduce two vital members of our LCRA team, John Hoffman, who serves as our Executive Vice President of Water, and John Meary, who's our Chief Administrative Officer. And they both work each and every day to provide exceptional customer service to our customers. I want to take a little bit of privilege with where Charlie was going and Dr. Hall on what LCRA is all about and spend a few minutes on that before we get to the water challenges. The state of Texas created LCRA, the Lower Colorado River Authority, back in the 1930s. We are not a state agency. We are technically a political subdivision of the state. We're subject to open meetings and open record laws. We are not state employees. And most importantly, we do not receive tax revenue. We operate with revenue we bring in largely from power, transmission, water, and community services. We've been around, as I said, since the Texas legislature created us in 1934 to manage a 600-mile stretch of the Colorado River between San Saba and the Gulf Coast. The problem then was floods, which ravaged central Texas from time and time again. The legislature told LCRA to solve the problem. So LCRA came in and we built 6 dams along the Colorado River to create the Highland Lakes. LCRA completed the final dam in the early 1950s. And we used those 6 dams and the Highland Lakes to manage floodwaters and store water for use during times of drought. We're in a terrible drought, but our lakes still have water in them. In fact, with proper water management, the lakes will have water for years to come, even if it didn't rain a drop. And that's because generations ago, LCRA designed the system to capture water when it rains a lot and hold it for times when it rains very little, which is what we've been in right now for several years. So the lakes are doing exactly what they were designed to do. The Highland Lakes provides water for more than 1 million people, as well as businesses, industries, the environment, and when available, for agriculture. The network of dams also launched LCRA as a public power entity because each dam had a hydroelectric generation capacity. Hydroelectric generation today is a small percentage of our electric power portfolio, but when the dams were built, hydroelectric generation played a much larger role. Today, hydroelectric generation is a byproduct of other river management activities or is used during a power emergency. The primary source of LCRA's revenue, or the money we get, is we sell electricity all over Central Texas. We sell it to cities, there are small towns and our customers. We sell it to co-ops. Those electric co-ops like Blue Bonnet, which is really close to y'all, Pernalis Electric Co-op, to name a few. We also own a number of beautiful parks and rivers access sites along the Colorado River, from the hill country to the Gulf Coast. And we also transmit power. Those big transmission lines you see all over the state, we're the second largest transmission provider in the state with 5,100 miles of transmission. And so we make the power, we transmit the power, and the people who buy the power from us are co-ops and cities, and we've been doing that for a long time. And everything we do at LCRA, we try to provide exceptional customer service. By fully meeting and understanding our customers' needs, we seek to earn their business each and every day. Now let me turn to what will it take to overcome Texas' water challenges. As we all know, Texas is facing a severe water challenge. Water is a resource that is critical for our state's growth. This is a fast-growing state dealing with a very significant drought. As a matter of fact, we think right now we're in a drought that is the most severe since the 1950s. So in almost 60 years, we're facing a challenge we haven't faced before. But having said that, I'm going to say something that's almost antithetically opposed to what I just said about a drought. And this is the premise of our conversation today. Texas has enough water. We just don't have it at the right time, the right place, and the right price. Let me explain. When I say we don't have enough water at the right time, I mean water can't show up as quickly as we'd like it to show up. Imagine you're a city, and this month, you know you're going to run short of 5,000 acre-feet. Ideally, the water would show up exactly the right time you need it. Today, it would be very difficult to make that happen. We also usually don't have water at the right place. Imagine you're still running that city, and you need to move water from point A to point B. Ideally, you'd have a series of reservoirs or groundwater wells connected to a system to transport water, almost like a wheel and hub system. You would have a series of spokes coming off the hub. That would allow water to be delivered at the right place. But we don't have a system like that today. We also don't have water at the right price. And this is probably the most difficult issue for us to work through. We as a society have not made the investment and infrastructure that it will take to solve our water challenges. Creation of the State Water Implementation Plan Fund for Texas was a fantastic start in our last legislative session, but it will take more. Let me give some insight into the growth we've had in this state, and you kind of see it here in Texas A&M because you're a microcosm of the overall state. We have a new Texan every 2 minutes. We have 1,200 people a day come to the state. We've added almost 5 million people in the last 12 years. And you know what's interesting about that? They're not bringing their water with them. They're not bringing reservoirs. They're not bringing pipelines. They're bringing thirst. And we have not kept up with the demand in terms of water infrastructure. There is also a policy aspect that goes hand in hand along with the price of water. We're living in a 19th century water policy in the 21st century economy. And this type of policy worked well for a long time. We were focused on an agricultural economy. But we did not anticipate the urban growth we've experienced in our state. Our policies also treat water differently than groundwater. For surface water, we have one set of rules. For groundwater, we have a different set of rules. And we apply those rules in a different way. But at the end, water is water. It's a molecule. And we need to have a conversation as a state with our policymakers, with the legislature, with our leaders like here at Texas A&M about what kind of consequences we could have to look at those rules in a different way. For example, local decisions about groundwater rules can create challenges. Under the current rules, even if Ellison owns land, and we do own some land, we can only get a 5-year permit for the water under the land we own. From a private property rights owner standpoint, I believe we ought to have more of a say, and certainly as a landowner, if I want to sell my water or use my water for a power plant, because that's how you use water sometimes to keep things cooler. Groundwater is also treated from a policy perspective as a local resource. But ironically, it's also included in our water plan from the state as a potential new source of statewide water. As a state, Texas should be clear on whether groundwater is for local use only, and if that is the case, Texas needs to take it off the table in the statewide water plan. In a sense, you can't have it both ways. You can't have groundwater saying it's part of local control, local ability, but it's in the statewide water plan. The state should have some say in that, or it should not, but you shouldn't have these two disparate ideas in conflict with each other. Alternatively, Texas could create the necessary policy and local economic incentive for groundwater to be used statewide. One additional challenge we have to overcome has to do with how we use water in our landscapes, and many of you can be leaders on this issue. We need to recognize that water is a finite resource. While we add additional supplies, we also need to have a conversation on how we use that water. We will have plenty of water for essential human use and for businesses, but that doesn't mean we should continue to create landscapes that are better suited for the tropics than for Texas. We need to be smart about how we design landscapes going forward, and your expertise can help with that. Just like we need water delivered at the right time, the right place, and the right price, we should create landscapes that use plants that are the right plants and in the right place. That means we shouldn't design water-hungry landscapes that can't survive a hot Texas summer. Many of you can help lead in that undertaking, how to design beautiful landscapes that make sense for Texas and our precious water supply. So what is Ellison doing now to address the challenges we've talked about? Because there's no doubt they are real and they're significant and they are severe. We're not waiting around for someone else to figure out all the answers to these challenges. Let me touch on some of the extraordinary action Ellison is taking now to increase our water supplies. Our board set an ambitious goal of increasing the water supply by 100,000 acre-feet by 2017. And maybe it's kind of level set. An acre-foot of water can supply enough water for 3 families for a whole year. That gives you a little perspective on how much water that is. And we're on our way to meeting that goal. First, we're building a new reservoir in the lower basin. The Lane City Reservoir Project, an off-channel reservoir in Wharton County, will be the first new water supply reservoir in the basin since the lakes were built back in the 1940s. According to the hydrology, the reservoir has the potential to produce up to 90,000 acre-feet of firm yield per year. And firm yield means you know it's going to be there. When you need it to be there, it can show up because you've got firm yield. It's water that's there all the time. The Texas Water Development Board is approved a financing for the project, and our board of directors gave the project the final go-ahead last month. To close, let me say I think it's time for Texas to have a conversation around its role in the transportation for water. I'd like to consider how we transport electricity across Texas. We could consider a pilot project to give the state a role in overseeing how we pay for this infrastructure to move water. Like the Public Utility Commission of Texas has a role in overseeing how we pay for infrastructure to move electricity. I would suggest that overcoming our water challenges is worthy of us making an investment in the future and that infrastructure. For example, Texas could offer loans with favorable terms through the Water Development Board for building water infrastructure. Texas could also create incentives for regional partners to collaborate. Entities like the LCRA, the Brazos River Authority, the Guadalupe Blanco River Authority, and others could create a pipeline together and then charge appropriately to deliver water. What's important to consider is the state may have an important role to play in water infrastructure, just like the state had an important role to play in building roads. And I'll close with a quick story as an example of that. Dr. Hall talked about how I ran TxDOT for a couple years. The reason TxDOT was created was because we had 254 counties in Texas. And up until the 1880s, every county had its own road system. So if you were the county judge in Travis County, and you decided a road should go right here, and the judge in Williamson County said the road was going to go right here, they would never connect, because the county judge decided that's where he wanted his road to go. And our legislature, to their credit, in the 1880s said, that's a bad idea. We ought to have roads connect to each other, so create a statewide highway system, the highway department. And you know, their first mission charge was to get farmers out of the mud. That was their mission statement, which is great to be in AgriLife talking about getting farmers out of the mud. And so there's an opportunity there that we can solve Texas water challenges, I believe. We can talk about the right time, the right place, the right price. We can talk about infrastructure and have a healthy conversation about how water should be treated, that molecule being a molecule, whether it is groundwater or surface water. And they're healthy conversations for a state to have that's growing as fast as we're growing with the challenge we face collectively. But it's going to take collaboration, it's going to take partnership, bridge building, and consensus, and also a chance of people checking their interests at the door to some degree. And that's often the most difficult thing to do in public policy, is how do you talk about these things in a way to say, how do you get there in 5 years, in 10 years, in 50 years? Because people are still coming to Texas. They're still coming to Texas A&M. They're still coming to College Station because this is a great place to be educated. It's a great place to live, to work, to raise your family. And our challenges are great, and our infrastructure has to keep up. So I'm honored to be here today as part of the Ellison Distinguished Lecture. I've never been distinguished in anything before, so I'm excited about that. And happy to take questions right now if you'll have any questions or comments or suggestions for us. And thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. Thank you. Well, and as I made the comment, so I understand your question on, we have to be who we are as a people. And I grew up in the Abilene, San Angelo area. This is lush to me. You've got trees, you've got grass. There's no water and trees in West Texas. We have to be able to be thoughtful to our environment, try to utilize that resource in a smart way, to put the right kind of plantscapes and landscaping and work around that so native production, if appropriate, is there, and that we live to who we are in our environment, to make it beautiful, to take advantage of that, at the same time understand that water is finite and we have to move it and have the cost associated with that and be sensitive to that in the process. So I think there's a true role that the green infrastructure has to be part of that, and the overall holistic of how you design and how you work and how you think through that. You know, the economies of scale we've gotten in production in most parts, let's call it housing, has made lives dramatically better. And I think the same kind of best practices can be applied in our green infrastructure the same way. And I know there are a lot of thought leaders around that are here. And we just need to get those messages and visions out there, and LCR can be part of that, I hope, of how we best utilize our finite resource to have that kind of vision there. You know, I think that is probably the greatest untapped issue, and where we have to go is from basic research and applied research to commercialization. And the valley of death we've had in that process for all technologies is really a challenge because we don't pay for water appropriately. And so you don't have an economic incentive to go off and do the solution, because if your customer's LCRA and we're not able to charge for what the cost of the good is, unlike Apple or someone else with the technology being developed, you have an economic incentive to go do it because it's not just for the public good, which is great, you also get paid for it. So we need to have mechanisms where you can take ideas like that and assign an economic value where people can get paid for taking their basic research, the applied research, the commercialization stage, the lifeline. And so there's some really cool things out there. We've got a product we're looking at right now where you can put it on the water and it stops evaporation. That's awesome, but it costs something. And then you've got people screaming, well, I want to pay $1 more for acre foot. That's a made-up number, whatever it's going to be, because I don't want to have that. So we have to have that willing to step outside of our comfort zone and that research side to say, these are cool things we can do. Whether it's a technology component, we're doing a project right now with NASA. NASA's funded. And they're looking at inflows and using modern technology, satellites. We might gain something off of that to understand when we're going to drought a record earlier or not. So you have kind of the inoculation prevention model to send an early warning system to new types of technology. And then the last part of that, I'm a big enthusiastic guy for where this can happen in the future, in 10 years, back to water supply at the right time, right place, right price, of using appropriate level of brackish desal you can treat. And if you can collaborate that through a solar panel system, and then you can have an underground storage technology, you could solve a lot of problems, but it costs something. And if you want to be able to take care of all your needs, you have to have the willingness to say, we're willing to invest in a pilot project to see if it's worth our effort as a state. I'm most impressed by what Israel does. Israel takes a proactive approach. It's a desert. If you've ever been to Israel and you've seen pictures, you know it's a desert. But they have enough water. And why is that? Because they invested in technology through the research to get to what they can do to have potable water supply, take care of agriculture, take care of businesses, take care of industry. So you have to think that same way, because Texas, in many ways, you go west of 35, is a lot like Israel. Ellison is happy to do that. So if we can have them make the rules, we'll do it. We're happy to do it. But that's a good point. And that gets, in all seriousness, the public policy challenge of 25 million people, several major metropolitan areas, groundwater, surface water, how you pay for it. So you have to have this ability to experiment with coalitions being built, transportation by the state, and I think that's a very vital state role, because at least if you have the ecosystem and the infrastructure around it, you might have some ability to migrate. Roads lined up, exactly. Yes, sir. Oh, here comes the hard one. Got the economist coming after me now. Well, so it's really hard to punish somebody who just showed up. So, no, but I'm using. Let's talk. I'm in Cedar Park, and Cedar Park is one of the fastest growing cities in the United States. As a matter of fact, San Marcos is even faster. They're not in our service territory, but we may sell water to them someday. So you're in Cedar Park. You just showed up. Am I going to charge a new resident of Cedar Park a differentiated rate? Or am I going to treat them the same? Or if you're an agriculture user who historically has had water, so what we try to do and balance that is we try to have a one basin approach where you have an embedded rate. And when that new supply comes on, we're looking at doing a couple of what I call modular reservoirs, one of which is next to the city of Austin. If that benefits my firm customers who are mostly residential and or businesses, I need them to pay for that rate because somebody paid for that rate for them 30, 40, or 50 years ago. They've had the benefit of being part of the system. And when you aren't able to make a profit, then you try to embed the overall socialized cost. I mean, socialized in a good way, what you're trying to do to keep your overall cost structure as low as possible and not have a penalty fee for that. Now, I think there is a conversation around infrastructure where if you turn on a peaker, I use that example of 5,000 acre feet need to show up, then you can charge a premium associated prices for water on demand that someone has to have immediately, and I call a 6-month period of time because they're in a drought or they didn't plan accordingly. But for our basic customer, I think it's pretty hard for us to do a segregated pricing on who's new and who's not and where you draw the line. That was all the hardest I've had to think in a long time. So an economist got me questions. Anybody else? So it wouldn't be an interbasin transfer because that's not a basin per se. That's surface water versus surface water river authorities on that. It's more of a groundwater transfer to San Antonio. I think there's some truth to that as I understand it. They're looking at every opportunity to get water to San Antonio because it's thirsty, just like Austin, but San Antonio is even thirstier. The protections you've got right now are what I just talked about, which is part of the challenge of how you identify, is that's part of a groundwater district. And all you get is 5 years to know how much you can draw out. They limit the amount. And right now, it's very hard to go to market and borrow money to build a pipeline or turn it on or to modify it accordingly. You may not be able to use an oil pipeline. It may not have the right technical configurations behind that. And so that's one of the issues we've got. If you want to take groundwater and you want to sell groundwater and you own it, it's on your land, you have a lot of uncertainty as to whether infrastructure can be built to that, because most of the time you need 30 years of bonding to pay it off. Can you set a price to that? It's like any other kind of building. You go A&M was to build and use university bonds, and it takes 30 years, they amortize that and pay it off. And the other thing you use, a very interesting word, and this becomes part of the challenge, is it's called our water, which summarizes my speech very nicely, because that's the challenge we face from a rural and urban standpoint, is the our water. And the state owns surface water. Local communities own groundwater. So our water is also surface water, because the state owns it, but counties treat groundwater as their water, because the state plans for it as everybody's water. And it's why we have to have these conversations, because that you summarize really nicely with that phrase about where transfers take place and how you move it and who it belongs to. And if I own the land and I also own that water, but I can't sell it, are you infringing my private property rights? Or if you have land next to me and you don't want to sell it, am I infringing upon yours? That really becomes a lot of the question. And then what's the right answer? And I think today's conversation is we have to start talking about it more. When you ask the question, it's very precise, and I appreciate that, because that captured where we are. Sure. So ERCOT stands for Electric Reliability Council of Texas. ERCOT runs our transmission grid. They make sure power shows up from point A to point B, then run the transmission lines. They're the air traffic controller as to when you need power to be there instantaneously. Now, water obviously doesn't move like an electron, power would be. So there's a conversation as to, is there an appropriate role for Texas to have an ERCOT-like water environment from an infrastructure standpoint? Now, if you had the groundwater issue resolved and surface water could point A to point B, we had interbasin transfer that was easy, and you could sell it and show up when you need it. But I think it's going to take political leadership of much greater magnitude than the speaker on the dais has to address that and start having a conversation. We're looking at a couple of pilot projects. We signed an MOU with the Guadalupe Blanco River Authority to see, are there things we could do together in creating our own pilot project with a pipeline. But that's not the same as a statewide approach, where I think the state has to have a significant role in where it would be built, how it would operate, how you assign the pricing to it, and work in that way. But we have to get the policy side, which is really where it starts, addressed. I'm not saying corrected or fixed, but addressed. And really have an understanding of who has what and where it's planned to. And then you can start planning for that infrastructure rather, because if you don't know where your product's going to work, then you can't really get the pipeline or the infrastructure. So you have to start with that issue and then go from there. But I think the state has a definite role to play in that if they so choose. It depends on where you are. The question was, where's desalination in the water plan for Texas? You basically have two different kinds of desal. You've got brackish desal and you've got ocean water desal. Your brackish desal will probably cost between $900 to $1,100 an acre foot. We charge $175 an acre foot for the water we sell today, so it's about 5 to 6 times more expensive for brackish desal just to have the treatment of that, because it's very high in energy to get the salinity down and bring your salt levels out. Ocean water is usually about $1,600 to $2,200 an acre foot, so you get incrementally more because there's more salinity in the ocean water to treat that way. I think there's a strong desire to get it into the plan, but then there's not a strong desire to have people pay for it. It's that basic challenge we're running into in the economics, is everybody wants this opportunity. They like the coolness of it, but they don't want it in their blended rate. So I think that's going to take some innovation. San Antonio has a project right now that they're partnering with CPS, which is their version of LCRA. They're a power company that runs power for San Antonio's partnered with SAWS, which is their water company. They're separate under a city utility. And they're doing a brackish desal project right now. I think that could be a great example of how this could work out. And they're blending that into a rate. It's about San Antonio being very thirsty again. So it's part of the solution and something we've got to look at, but somebody wants somebody else to be the first mover. Their desal, I think, John, is about $1,200 an acre foot for that. So it's expensive water, but it's only going to be an incremental add to the overall supply. But I think that's how I have to view it, as incremental as additional supply for us, not the panacea. Well, we're the wholesale provider, so we're agnostic to that. The question was, how do you think about allotments and where's Texas in the allotment process? So we basically will have a contract as long as our level of how much water we have is above a certain level, and it is right now, we sell that water. So we sell all the time because that pays for our dams, that pays for our river operations center, that pays for our infrastructure to take care of that. So on the city side, yes. So we sell it to the city, who then has to make a determination on a policy side, how much do they want to pay for, and do they want to allot that? Now, when the water levels go below a certain level, we step in and we do a pro rata curtailment. It's 20% below what they currently get. So if the Highland Lakes get below 600,000 acre feet, we do a 20% pro rata curtailment on all customers. They'll get 20% less water. It's part of us managing the system to keep it healthy that way. I think allotments are a good conversation. I think a better conversation for that, if I can be king of the world for a day, is really a much more driven scarcity pricing model, where you have to pay more for the water you get, and it's incremental in value. So if you want more water, you pay more for that water in the process, because you send a signal to people you need to conserve. And Austin does some of that as a step up where we live. But I think the more that you do that, whoever you are, is probably a better economic kind of constraint behind that. Russ, they can buy so much water from us. They have a contract. So they buy 10,000 acre feet, and they're allotted that. And if we get below a certain level in our lakes, they get a 20% haircut down to 8,000 acre feet under that hypothetical situation. I think a way to look at it in our value is you could have a trigger point on pricing, but it is so hard for customers to understand, because we're really a fixed price society when it comes to wholesale pricing on something. So the cities almost have to work that out themselves to say what they think is a better conservation mode. It is, and the interesting constraint on that, though, is the less water you use, the less money the city gets. And they're in a death spiral right now on infrastructure because they can't take care of what they've got. So if you had a way where you actually charge them more for that allotment, so they don't have a decrease in revenues, because they have to pay for water and sewer and all the other stuff associated with that. It's a really interesting thing. It's very confusing. You say, well, if I conserve water, my bill should go down. No, it goes up because they sold less water, they're going to pay for the same fixed cost. Well, if I use more water, my bill should go. So you get that real cycle, because I have a fixed cost, it's always there. So I like the sense where you pay more in that process, that's enough to send the signal to cover their operating costs without creating the death spiral that some of the utilities are going through right now. I think thank you all so much for having me. Appreciate it very much.